what if the most heartbreaking character in the Testaments isn't the one who dies, but the one who slowly realizes she was never truly safe to begin with? Because when people talk about tragedy in Gilead, they usually focus on the obvious victims, the ones who suffer loudly, the ones who rebel, the ones whose stories feel dramatic and visible. But what if the real tragedy belongs to someone much quieter, someone like Hulda? And honestly, the more you think about her role in the story, the more disturbing it becomes. Because Hulda is not written like a traditional hero or rebel. She is not someone who immediately challenges the system. She is not someone who openly resists. She is someone who tries to survive inside Gilead by doing what many girls are forced to do there. Stay small, stay obedient, stay unnoticed. And that might be exactly why her fate feels so tragic. Because in systems like Gilead, invisibility is never protection. It is just delayed suffering. And the show may be slowly revealing that truth through her character. One of the most important things to understand about Hulda is how she behaves around authority. She does not question openly. She does not push boundaries aggressively. Instead, she watches. She adapts. She studies the room before she speaks or acts. And that kind of behavior usually gets misread as safety. But it is actually survival conditioning. Because in Gilead, girls are trained very early to understand one thing clearly. Survival depends on reading power correctly, not challenging it. So Hulda learns to observe instead of resist, to endure instead of react, to wait instead of act. But here is the terrifying question the series is slowly forcing us to ask. What happens when survival itself becomes the trap? Because the more Hulda adapts to Gilead, the more she becomes part of its rhythm. Not ideologically, not emotionally, but behaviorally. She learns when to speak, when to stay silent, when to lower her eyes, and when to disappear into the background. And over time, that kind of adaptation creates something dangerous. It makes injustice feel normal, not acceptable, but familiar. And familiarity is one of Gilead's strongest weapons. Because once cruelty becomes routine, resistance starts to feel emotionally complicated instead of instinctive. And that may be where Hulda's tragedy begins. Not in a single moment of violence, but in the slow, emotional rewiring of what she believes she can expect from life. One of the subtle clues the story gives us is how Hulda reacts in group environments compared to private moments. Around authority, she is careful, controlled, and almost rehearsed. But in quieter spaces, there are glimpses of something else: confusion, fear that is not fully processed. Small moments where she seems to be realizing that the rules around her are not actually stable or fair. They are just enforced. And that realization is dangerous in Gilead. Because once someone stops seeing the system as natural, they start seeing it as constructed. And anything constructed can, in theory, fall apart. But Hulda is not in a position of power. She is not protected. She is not safe enough to fully explore that realization. So what happens instead? She suppresses it. And suppression is where tragedy grows quietly. Because suppressed awareness does not disappear. It lingers, it builds. It returns in fragments. Doubt, hesitation, emotional fatigue, fear without clear cause. And the audience may be watching Hulda slowly experience that internal conflict without her ever being able to name it. Which raises an even more painful question. How many girls in Gilead are going through the same thing right now? One of the most disturbing elements of Hulda's position is how easily she can be overlooked. She is not the loudest voice in the room. She is not the most visibly rebellious. She is not the character the system feels immediately threatened by. And historically, systems like Gilead do not collapse because they focus on the loudest threats. They collapse because they ignore the quiet ones. The ones who are watching everything, remembering everything, feeling everything internally while saying very little externally. Hulda may represent exactly that kind of danger without anyone recognizing it yet. But here is the emotional contradiction that makes her story so painful. Because Hulda is also someone who still wants safety, still wants stability, still wants to believe that if she follows the rules closely enough, she will be protected. And that belief is exactly what Gilead exploits. The system constantly reinforces the idea that obedience equals safety. But over time, Hulda may begin to realize something she cannot easily escape. Obedience does not guarantee safety. It only guarantees compliance. And those are not the same thing. That realization, once it starts forming, changes everything internally. Because it breaks the emotional logic that has been keeping her stable. And once that logic breaks, fear stops being simple. It becomes layered, confusing, constant. One of the most tragic possibilities in Hulda's arc is that she may never become a dramatic symbol of rebellion. She may never lead a revolution. She may never have a defining heroic moment that changes everything in one instant. Instead, her tragedy may be quieter. She may simply wake up one day and fully understand the truth of where she is, while still being unable to leave it, still unable to resist it, still unable to safely act on what she knows. And that kind of awareness without power is one of the most psychologically painful states a person can exist in. Because knowledge without control does not free someone. It traps them in clarity. And clarity inside Gilead is dangerous, not because it is empowering, but because it is isolating. The more Hulda understands, the more she may feel separated from the people around her who are still surviving through denial or obedience. And that emotional isolation can become its own form of punishment. So when we ask what Hulda's fate might be, the question is not just whether she survives physically. It is about whether she survives mentally intact. Whether she can hold on to herself inside a system that constantly demands she shrink, comply, and forget. Because Gilead does not only punish resistance, it also slowly erodes identity. And Hulda may represent the quiet version of that erosion, not through one dramatic collapse, but through small compromises repeated over time until the original version of herself becomes harder and harder to recognize. And that may be the saddest fate in the Testaments. Not death, not rebellion, but the slow disappearance of self while still living inside the system that is erasing you. And what makes Hulda's situation even more heartbreaking is that she may not even recognize the exact moment it starts happening. There is no clear turning point where she decides to give up, no single decision that marks the loss of herself. Instead, it happens in small emotional adjustments, choosing silence instead of honesty, choosing compliance instead of risk, choosing survival over expression, and each choice makes sense in isolation. That is what makes it so dangerous. Because from the inside, it never feels like surrender. It feels like practicality. It feels like staying alive one more day. But over time, those small choices begin to stack up into something irreversible. Hulda may start to realize that she has become someone who reacts instead of acts, someone who observes life more than she participates in it. And that realization itself becomes painful because it creates a version of grief that has no clear object. She is not mourning a person who died. She is mourning the version of herself that slowly stopped existing while she was still alive. And in a place like Gilead, that kind of silent self-loss may be the most common tragedy of all.